Hello, in this video we're going to give you a bit of a background on the science of learning. So this is a follow-on from what we've been talking about previously, but going a little bit further into what the science is telling us about how learning works and what that means for our theories of development and learning overall. So to give you a bit of a recap of where we were before, we've talked a lot about all the different kinds of learning theories that are out there and given a fairly broad overview of some of the major historical sort of trends in the ways that we think about what learning is and how it occurs in educational settings. So one example of this where it's sort of mapped out here is that you can see that there have been lots of people involved in this over a long period of time, but I think what's really important for us to get our head around now is the bit that's at the bottom here. So we talked a lot about behaviorism previously, and we talked a lot about the cognitive revolution that came after that. But now we're seeing that there are sort of two distinct kind of camps around all of this. One is much more focused on the social cultural side of learning, and the other side is much more embedded within the kind of cognitive way of thinking. So if you remember, the cognitive way of thinking is really about thinking about learning from an information processing point of view. Whereas the other side is much more about thinking about the social and cultural and political side of what happens in educational settings. So that's not to say that there isn't some overlap between them, but to a large extent they are fairly separate ways of thinking about learning. And a lot of the different theories that we talk about in this course will tend to fall one way or the other. So obviously when we're talking about the science of learning, we're tending more towards the sort of cognitive way of thinking about what learning is. Within that, I think is a really important aspect of this, and that is that we're also thinking about learning from a very biological point of view. So this has obviously come about a lot from the sorts of technologies that we now have access to that are allowing us to understand what's going on in the brain in a far more sophisticated way than we ever have been able to do previously. So in the last 20 years or so, we've learned more about how the brain functions than we have in all of previous history. So there is an element of this which is inevitably going to be about what does that biological knowledge that we're starting to develop mean for the way that we understand what learning is. And as I've pointed to previously, I think that there is something about this continuum from the kind of universal things that we understand about basic neuronal processes through to what happens in a classroom. However, that is a very complicated process to get from one end to the other here. So while we can be pretty confident about what might be happening at the neuron level and be fairly certain that that's the same sort of thing that we will see in everybody's brains, it's much more complicated when we get to the classroom, and we'll unpack that a little bit more as we go. Now, thinking about what's happening in the brain and the mind and how that then plays out in classrooms is not really a new thing. This is something that's been going on for nearly 20 years now, since the early 2000s. And there was a particular push in the United States around this, which was tied up in this agenda, which was called the What Works agenda. And there are still remnants of this sort of stuff on the internet. So you can find this, the What Works Clearinghouse. If you just Google that, it will come up pretty much straight away. And the idea here was to take the sort of foundational evidence from neuroscience and from experimental psychology and think about what that meant for understanding what actually works in a classroom setting. Obviously, it's not quite that simple. As you know, we've found out over time, there's been a lot of backlash against this, but I think that there has certainly been quite a lot of this that has been valuable for understanding exactly what does and what doesn't work in terms of learning. The tricky thing is that how that then plays out in practice, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. And obviously, there's been a lot of excitement about some of the work that's been done in terms of how learning occurs in the brain. And it's pretty common for you to see these sorts of stories out there. You know, the brain is involved in acrobatics, for example. Not quite sure about that, but it's a nice analogy, I suppose. The other side of all of this, I think, that often gets forgotten when we're talking broadly about learning theories is that there is an element of this which is also about the kind of clinical side of learning. So if you look in the current version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is DSM-5, if you're not familiar with this, this is the kind of manual that you will use to understand what all of the criteria are for diagnosing various different psychological disorders. So what schizophrenia is, what dissociative identity disorder is, and so on and so forth. So there are quite a number of disorders in here that are described that are related to learning, and certainly there is a very strong branch of educational psychology in particular that is focused on learning difficulties around things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, and other sort of developmental and learning kinds of disorders. So I think it's important for us to recognise that within this sort of biological focus that we've had, now that we've got quite sophisticated tools of understanding what's happening in people's brains, that there is an element of this that has been focused on the kind of clinical side of things. What can we do to actually understand things like autism or other learning disorders? So really, when we think about this, we can split it into three kind of broad camps here. So the science of learning is one aspect of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of areas that are bordering this notion of a science of learning. There are the socio-cultural ideas that we said, which was the other big part of that split. And then sort of sitting beside all of this are more clinical approaches to understanding deficits that may or may not appear in various different sorts of studies around brain activity and those sorts of things. Now, there's been a lot of toing and froing between these, so the different camps tend to argue quite a bit about who's right. So this is one fairly recent example. Noam Chomsky, who was one of the pioneers of the cognitive revolution a few decades ago, he is arguing quite strongly against the influence of postmodernism, which underpins a lot of the socio-cultural theory that we see playing out in that particular branch of the learning theories that we're talking about. So on the one side, there's quite strong criticism there, but if we look at the other side, there's also quite strong criticism the other way. So from people who come from more of a socio-cultural background, they tend to be quite critical of the more science-based approaches, saying that they can tend to be reductionist, that they might be quantifying things that are very hard to quantify, and that the basic sorts of processes and things that we might see in a highly controlled laboratory environment may or may not tell us much about what is happening in real-life classrooms. So the issue here is that we have two separate ways of thinking about these things that are based on fundamentally different kind of assumptions, philosophical assumptions about where the best place to do the research is, what the kinds of methodologies are, and the sort of underpinning way of thinking about these things, whether it's a sort of socio-cultural one or a more cognitive, biological side. And often you'll see these two things being pitted against each other, which I think is a bit of a shame, because my own view is that I think that there is a lot of room for both, and that's something that we'll talk about a bit more over the semester. So within this, there have been people who have just argued that it's just simply too far. Right? So it's great that we're understanding biologically what's happening in people's brains and how that influences how they learn, but to go from there and do something useful with that might be relevant to a classroom environment, very tricky. And the argument is that it's just too far away and that it's not a viable thing to do. So let's put the argument aside for a second and focus on the science of learning side of this and why it's important for the way that we understand what learning and development are, and how that's contributed to the overall theory. So the science of learning can be broadly seen as a set of overlapping disciplines. You can see here, we've touched on this before, and in the middle of all of these, we've got mind, brain, and education science, if you like. So psychology, neuroscience, education, working together in this broader area of the science of learning. It is related to a number of other disciplinary areas, and certainly there's quite a bit of overlap between them. So you might hear terms like the learning sciences, learning and instruction, educational psychology, the branch that's not focused on the kind of clinical side of learning and development, and this other notion of educational neuroscience, which is a little bit less popular now, but you will still see that some people will talk about this notion of educational neuroscience. The top two tend to be the most dominant kinds of views at the moment. You'll tend to see one community that will refer to all of this as the science of learning, and a very closely related community which is around the learning sciences. They've got a slightly different focus in the way that they look at things, so the learning sciences tends to do a little bit less sort of neuroscience type work, but there is quite a strong overlap between the two sorts of communities. In Europe, there is a separate community, quite a larger community, which is the European Association for Research in Learning and Instruction, which does broadly similar work, but is a bit more inclusive. So they're not necessarily about highly quantitative approaches, but there does tend to be quite a strong focus on that. So the point here is that there are lots of different groups and sort of sub-disciplines that seem to be broadly related. Officially in Australia, for the ways that research is categorised, there is no category for the science of learning, but there is a category or a field of research code for learning sciences. So a lot of us who tend to do work in this area, while we might refer broadly to what we're doing as the science of learning, it's officially categorised as learning sciences by the government. The university has been involved in a Science of Learning Research Centre for the last 4 years, so the University of Queensland's been leading that, and you can see that there are a whole lot of other universities involved. This is unfortunately coming to an end now, which is a shame, because it feels like the centre's only really just starting to get going, but that's the way funding works sometimes. So this as a university has been a place that's been very strong in the science of learning. Which is why we tend to focus on it quite strongly in these sorts of theoretical subjects. At the same time, as I've pointed to, there are other ways of thinking about what learning is, but we do have quite a strong focus on this because this is the sort of research that goes on within the university, and is the sort of research that I've been involved in myself, both here and previously at the University of Melbourne. So the question for us is that we have all of these new tools and ways of understanding what's going on in the brain. We have sort of imaging type approaches where we can look right down into what's happening at various levels. We can do things like this, electroencephalogram, which is understanding what's happening on the cortex, and has other sorts of benefits, but obviously doesn't get a deep scan right down into the brain. We'll talk about all of that sort of stuff a little bit more in a later video. But really what we're trying to understand is what it means in our classroom environments, including these sorts of environments in lecture theatres that we're all familiar with. So really there are a couple of questions around all of this. We need to think carefully about what the advantages of taking a scientific approach to understanding learning are. And I guess the main ones are really that we can determine cause and effect in a much more systematic way than we would be able to do in the messy, complicated classroom environment. So there is an element of this that's about rigour and about actually understanding what's going on in people's brains and minds. And from there, we can start to kind of make sense of what that might mean in a classroom. The other side, of course, is that with rigour, we lose relevance. So in a highly controlled environment where you're scanning somebody's brain or doing some sort of experimental study, it looks less and less like a classroom. So when we think about what the problem is, that really is the issue that we're dealing with, that there's not necessarily going to be a very clear relationship between the sorts of things we see in controlled experimental studies and the sorts of things that go on in our messy classrooms. And the computer scientists have spent quite a lot of time thinking about these sorts of things, as computer scientists do. And this was a really great paper where, you can see Anderson there, has tried to actually think about the different steps at which we're sort of conducting research. And this is something that I think has been really helpful for understanding the difficulty of translating from lab-based research about learning into a classroom. And this is it, the timescales of human action. So you can see that there are orders of magnitude difference in time and space between the sorts of areas in which we focus in kind of neuroscience and experimental psychology and the sorts of time and space that we might be dealing with when we're trying to help our students understand a lesson, or in a university environment, how we help them to become doctors or lawyers or dentists or whatever it might be. So at the bottom there you can see that it's very small time scales, milliseconds and less, and generally we're talking about small parts of the brain, neural circuits or very small biological units. As we move up, we're seeing that we're starting to move into seconds and minutes, and that's the sort of thing that you would see in a kind of cognitive, more sort of experimental psychology type setting. The difficulty, of course, is how do we take something that's happening in such a small time span, in a small part of the brain, or is related to a very small kind of component of a task, if you like, and relate that to what we're doing in education, which takes months and involves basically neighbourhoods, society, all of these complicated factors that impact on what's happening. So back to our continuum, if we were to cut it down one end and look at what's happening in people's brains, we can be fairly certain that the sorts of patterns that we might see if we give most of us a task are going to look pretty similar across almost everybody, unless there's some sort of serious issue going on in somebody's brain. However, when we cut this at the other end, we can say with a lot less certainty that we know what we're seeing is the same for everybody. So the point here is that every step we take away from the basic experimental study over to a classroom setting, there is more and more complexity that we're going to see. Our students are going to be different, they're going to approach things in different ways, they're going to have different strategies for learning, they're going to have different prior knowledge, and so on. So the sorts of things that we can infer about how people learn in controlled environment become very messy in the real world. And this is the sort of classic study for me that I think captures this best in terms of what teachers need to do. Again, this was a group out of Carnegie Mellon University in the United States, and this time what they were attempting to do was to map out the number of possible ways in which one person could teach a lesson to one or more other people. And you can see that includes how many examples they give, what the timing of the feedback is, and so on and so forth. And there are a whole lot of different variables that they looked at to try and figure out of how many different options are teachers having to choose from when they develop a lesson. And they got about halfway through it, and the number was already that. So 205 trillion options, and that was only about half of it. So basically what we're dealing with as teachers is an almost infinite number of options in front of us in terms of how we design and deliver a lesson. So on top of the complexity that our students bring to the classroom setting, there is also an infinite number of options that we have in terms of how we deliver our lessons. So that's the kind of complexity that we're dealing with. It's very messy, and it's not easy for us to say, here's what's happening in a lab study, therefore we should do X, Y, and Z in a classroom now. So what do we do about all of this? So we've covered a bit of this ground before. Some of this should be a bit of a reminder of things that we've already talked about. What do we actually do about this? So does it mean that we should just give up because it really is a bridge too far? Well, a number of us have been looking at this for some time and published a bit of work around what this might mean and how we might make a meaningful translation. I was also involved in a book where we got a whole lot of people to contribute some ideas around what they think might be the best ways of understanding how we can make sense of these things in the classroom. Now, there are a number of ways that we can unpack these. So the purpose of doing the lab-based studies can be variable, and that then means that there are a number of different options for the ways that we might try and make sense of what those mean in practice. One of them there is diagnostic, so we can use basic studies or imaging studies to try and help us diagnose whether a student is suffering from dyslexia or dyscalculia or whatever it might be. For functional, we could understand what various parts of the brain do and what their function is. Might be a little bit less useful immediately for us in a classroom setting, but overall, an important foundation for us to understand how the brain works. Conceptually, we might see that the sorts of things that we may see around feedback in very controlled studies, for example, might help us to better understand how feedback works in a classroom environment. Now, keeping in mind there that the way that a neuroscientist would think about feedback is going to be very different to the way that we would think about feedback as teachers. The last one there, the Holy Grail, is about prescriptive. So can we do some studies, some highly controlled studies that give us a clear indication and provide some sort of prescription or recipe or formula that tells us what to do in the classroom? Obviously, that one's very difficult given the complexity we've just talked about. So the trick here is really how we get from basic principles of learning, and there are a number of them out there I'll talk about in a second, and convert those into something that teachers can use in practice. Now, my sense is that I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we can come out of a lab-based study with an image of a student's brain and say, you should teach a student like this now. It's not quite that simple, but it can give us a set of tools that as teachers, we can make a decision of those tools are going to be most useful for our students, for the content that they need to learn in the context in which we're teaching. So partly this is about being able to provide something to teachers to be able to make better decisions about how to do what they're probably already doing quite well. And that, I think, is the real secret of the science of learning. Not to tell teachers what to do, but to provide them a set of tools that allow them to do their job more effectively than what they're already doing. But ultimately the power is in the hands of the teachers to do that. And a lot of people, including a number of the resources that I've recommended to you for this course, have attempted to unpack what these things might mean for teachers. But ultimately, really, it's still about a set of principles of learning. And again, people have produced all sorts of interesting ideas around what some of the major things that we're understanding about basic learning processes are and how they might help with education. The problem, of course, is that there is still quite a significant gap between what we understand in these principles and how it plays out in the classroom. And we've talked about this gap quite a bit. So my colleagues and I have written about this. We've talked about this as being kind of the hard problem that we're dealing with. And this is something we'll revisit later on when we talk a little bit more about the brain, the mind, and how we understand those and what they mean for education. There is a sort of assumption in all of this that the kind of biological information or the biological findings that we're getting out of these imaging studies are the kind of dominant and most rigorous, and we should pay more attention to those than anything else. I tend to think that there's probably another way that we could go about this, and that really is thinking more systematically about all of the different forms of evidence and what it might tell us about learning. Ultimately, I would argue, and other people may have different views on this, but I would argue that learning is something that occurs predominantly in the mind. It happens within a social context, of course, but we can't measure the mind directly. We can't measure the minds of our students. While we might be able to see what's happening in their brains, what's happening in their mind, which again is probably a different thing, and we'll revisit that next week. We can't measure that directly, so the more ways that we can infer what might be going on, the more confidence we can have that we're really seeing the developmental process of learning play out. And this is an argument that I and some colleagues have been making for the last couple of years, in that all of these things are important to help us understand that, whether it's assessment or the ways that students self-report or what sorts of things are going on in their brain. Their behaviour also helps us to understand this. So rather than squabbling about which of these is best, it's really about thinking more systematically about how all of them work together to help us to understand student learning. Aligned with that is a movement towards open science, and this I won't dwell on for a lot of time, but I think it is an important way of us trying to bridge this gap between different ways of understanding what learning is. So the open science framework really is about trying to make the research process much more transparent. So a lot of what we know about learning has been written up in journal articles and in books and things like that, but really we only sort of get the end result of all of this. So what's the results of the studies and what do the authors think it means, but we don't necessarily know exactly how they did it. We haven't had access to their data, and they may have changed the story along the way. So the open science approach really is about following a similar sort of scientific cycle. You can see there, from developing ideas right the way through to collecting data, interpreting those findings and writing it up. So that part is not necessarily different. What is different is that within this framework, people are pre-registering their studies, which means they say in advance what they're going to do and what they expect to find, which means that they're not necessarily going to change the story once they've got the data. But it's also about making their data and their study materials available. Now, how does this relate to what we've been talking about in terms of the science of learning? Well, one of the difficulties here has been trying to make sense of the basic research and how we might use it. Now, if we don't have a clear picture or a transparent picture of how people did studies, what they were expecting to find, what kind of material they used, and so on, it's much harder to understand what that might mean for teaching practice. So we've been arguing now for a little while that this is probably a really useful way of thinking about how that translation might play out. And this is something that I think we'll see more and more about over the next few years. The other thing I think that's important here is that people have been working very closely on how to bridge this specific gap between principles and practice. And there's been a lot of talk around things like implementation science. This is very popular, particularly in the United States, where people have been thinking very carefully, not just about the evidence at one end or the other, but how to actually meaningfully implement the sorts of things that we're seeing in laboratory-based studies into classrooms. This is a relatively new area, so there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, but the idea here is that there are people who are specifically focused on the translation process itself, and that's an important part of what the science of learning is and will continue to be as we understand more and more about how learning works and our theories of learning and development become more sophisticated over time. So there are people working on this particular part as well. Now, one way that I think that is most important for this, and you may have come across this before, is around a design cycle. So many of you have no doubt heard a lot of excitement about design thinking, and really design is just a systematic way of breaking down a problem into more sort of manageable parts. And you can see that it does sort of fit with the way that we think about what might come up in an educational setting. So you can see that there are generally a series of steps there. People will vary on these in different ways, but a lot of the design models are fairly similar in terms of the kind of stepwise process that they present to break these problems down and come up with solutions. So first part is empathizing and coming up and thinking about what's happening in the environment, understanding the context and so on. Second part is trying to define that in a more meaningful way. Third part is kind of brainstorming and thinking about the kinds of solution, then prototyping that solution, testing it out and seeing if it works. Now, where I think the science of learning might be useful in informing what's happening in education, again to bridge that gap between principles and practice, is that the evidence that we're finding from the basic learning processes about how all this happens could be used to help us define the problem more accurately. It could inform the way that we might brainstorm about issues, and it could also help us develop prototypes to address whatever the kind of issue might be. So the other thing I think that's important here is that this whole design process should then feed back into the body of evidence that we've got. So for me, I think design is one way that we can provide some sort of structure for turning principles into practice. And certainly in the experience that I've had with people who are teaching in adult settings, particularly in universities and vocational settings, this has been a really useful way of thinking about how we might use the evidence from the science of learning in a meaningful way. The design thinking provides a structure to allow people to do that. And having worked with quite a few people from K-12 education as well, this is something that they seem to find quite useful in breaking down the sorts of issues that they're seeing and thinking about meaningful ways of using evidence in practice. So one other way of thinking about this, which is sort of coming at it from the other perspective, is I've talked a lot about in the last couple of slides the idea of problems or issues or things that crop up. Now, there are different ways of thinking about what research is. One of them is about how much it provides for generalized knowledge, and on the other axis there you can see relevance for immediate applications. So you've probably got a fair idea of what pure basic research is. It's good for generalized knowledge, not quite as good for immediate application. The other side, the pure applied research, much more useful for immediate application, a bit less useful for generalized knowledge. Well, what we're talking about here is Pasteur's quadrant, you can see, which is in the top corner there, which is a little bit of both. And the idea here is that some of the things that we might see in our classrooms actually provide really good foundations for the things that we probably need to research and understand a little better. So the science of learning is not just about saying, here are things that we're discovering about the brain and mind in the lab, how do we then implement those in the classroom? It works the other way as well, which is what are some of the things that we're seeing in the classroom and how can the science of learning actually help us to understand what those things are a little better. So this idea of use-inspired basic research is important in relation to this. So it's not just about the basic research being applied to practice, but it's about practice informing what happens in basic research, which then hopefully creates a cycle of improvement, if you like. What I also would mention is that the slides that I create for you, the videos that I make, including this one, are all built on an approach that is founded in the science of learning. So this is a good example of this. Again, a colleague of mine wrote this paper which tells us about the ways in which the brain and mind tend to process what's on slides. So you'll notice that I tend to have very little text. I use images a lot. I'm not expecting you to obviously read the text that's on this slide here, but I think also cueing you to seeing what some of these papers look like is helpful as a kind of memory trace as well. So the sorts of things that I'm doing in the way that I develop the resources for this subject are based in themselves on the science of learning. But at the same time, as we've talked about, a big part of this is that I, as a teacher, make choices about which of those things I think are most relevant for you and most relevant for this content to make the most effective resources. So it's partly about the science, but it's also partly about the decisions that I make as a teacher in terms of how I'm going to design and deliver the material for you. Okay, so we've done a quick overview of what the science of learning is and how it fits into all of this, but what does it mean for our kind of learning theories? Well, there are a number of points in which I think a scientific way of going about doing this underpins quite a lot of the different things we see in the broad notions of learning theories. So it doesn't tell us the whole story, but it certainly helps us to understand how we've got a foundation that will support various ideas that are represented across the range of things in learning theory. And some of the readings that I've put in place for you really dig a little bit deeper into this. So I think that this is a really good kind of summary of where we've been, and it's under the heading of educational psychology, but really it's talking about more broadly the science of learning and understanding what's going on from a kind of quantitative perspective, if you like. And Patricia Alexander has been around for a long time. Very senior researcher, very experienced, done some great work in this area. And I think it's worth having a look at this because she points to a number of different areas in which we're getting a better understanding of these things and the real contribution of the science of learning to how education is designed and delivered. So part of this is, of course, about the kind of psychological underpinnings. There's a really important element of this that's about interdisciplinarity, so people from neuroscience and psychology and education working together. Learning is really at the core of all of this, although we understand that a big part of this obviously then relates to teaching as well. There's an investment in measurement, for better or worse, and takes into account that our students are different in lots of different ways. And at the end of all of that, it's really about coming up with evidence-based approaches for what we're doing in our teaching practice. So you can see that what she's done is really give the kind of main areas in which we're seeing contribution from the science of learning to education. Now, one of the main reasons I think that that's really important for us to keep in mind is that the sort of situation we're finding ourselves in now is that economists and politicians and policy people are really driving the agenda in Australia around education. And I think it's important for all of us to be mindful that there is a really strong body of evidence that's been developing for 100 years now, that's rigorous, that's scientific, that tells us all sorts of things about how learning works and how we can best construct or facilitate that learning in our classrooms. So for me, getting involved in fights over who's got the best methodology and who's got the best assumptions about these things is probably not doing us the best at the moment. And economists are providing quite simple answers to politicians that they seem to like better than what we can do. So that's a challenge for all of us, I think. Whether you end up in research or you end up as a teacher, it's important for us to think about the kind of evidence that we're using. Otherwise, we're all going to end up in a situation where economists are driving what we do, rather than good theory and evidence about learning. And I think that would be a real problem for all of us. So that's your overall summary of the science of learning. Hopefully that's useful, and we'll talk a bit more about the brain and the mind and how they relate to learning in the next video.